The transatlantic slave trade is often portrayed as a phenomenon that began in the mid-16th century, with English involvement commencing even later. This narrative conveniently overlooks a crucial period of early English engagement in the slave trade, specifically in the late 15th century. The prevailing historical account frequently skips over the activities of English merchants and sailors in the Iberian Peninsula during this era, a time when the slave trade was already a flourishing enterprise. Correcting this historical oversight is crucial for a comprehensive understanding of the roots of the transatlantic slave trade and the role of the English within it. The traditional narrative often places John Hawkins as the pioneer of English involvement in the slave trade in the 1560s. However, this perspective ignores the documented presence of English traders in the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Andalusia, decades earlier. These traders were not merely passive observers, but active participants in a well-established slave trade network. Their presence in the region coincided with the Reconquista, the Christian conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and the subsequent enslavement of Muslim populations. This period laid the groundwork for the later, more extensive English involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The omission of this early English involvement contributes to a skewed understanding of the historical context surrounding the slave trade. It minimizes the long-standing connection between England and the practice of slavery, creating a false impression of a later and less significant role. Furthermore, it obscures the complex interplay of religious, political, and economic factors that fueled the early slave trade in the Iberian Peninsula. A more accurate portrayal of this period requires acknowledging the presence and participation of English traders in the pre-Hawkins era. By examining primary sources from Spanish archives and other historical records, a more complete picture emerges. These documents reveal the presence of English ships and merchants in Andalusian ports, engaged in the trade of enslaved people. This early involvement demonstrates that the English were not latecomers to the slave trade, but had been involved in its precursor activities for decades. This crucial distinction challenges the conventional timeline and requires a reassessment of the English role in the broader history of slavery. The Andalusian slave markets of the late 15th century served as a hub for the trade of enslaved people from various regions, including North Africa. English merchants and sailors, drawn by the lucrative opportunities, frequented these markets, purchasing enslaved individuals and transporting them to other destinations. The presence of English ships in Andalusian ports is documented in Spanish archival records, providing concrete evidence of their participation in the slave trade. These records detail the arrival and departure of English vessels, often listing the goods they carried, including enslaved people. The English involvement in the Andalusian slave trade was not a peripheral activity, but a significant component of their maritime commerce. English merchants established connections with local traders and officials, facilitating their access to the slave markets. They actively sought out enslaved people, particularly those from North Africa, who were often perceived as valuable commodities. This demand fueled the capture and enslavement of individuals from across the Strait of Gibraltar, particularly from the Moroccan coast. The voyages undertaken by English ships between England and Andalusia were not solely dedicated to the slave trade, but often involved the exchange of other goods. However, the trade in enslaved people represented a substantial portion of their commercial activities. The profits generated from this trade contributed to the growth of English maritime power and the accumulation of wealth among English merchants. This economic incentive further solidified their involvement in the slave trade, creating a vested interest in its continuation. The presence of English traders in Andalusia highlights the interconnectedness of the early slave trade networks. It demonstrates that the slave trade was not a localized phenomenon, but a complex system involving multiple actors and spanning vast geographical distances. The English, through their participation in the Andalusian markets, became an integral part of this international network, contributing to the growth and expansion of the slave trade. Moroccan captives constituted a significant portion of the enslaved population traded in the Andalusian markets. Captured during raids and conflicts, these individuals were often transported across the Strait of Gibraltar and sold to European merchants, including the English. The demand for Moroccan slaves stemmed from various factors, including their perceived strength, resilience, and adaptability. They were often employed in agricultural labor, domestic service, and other forms of forced labor. The capture and enslavement of Moroccans had a devastating impact on the coastal communities of North Africa. Raids by both European and North African powers resulted in the depopulation of villages and towns, disrupting social structures and economic activities. Families were torn apart, and the constant threat of capture created a climate of fear and insecurity. The human cost of this trade was immense, leaving a lasting legacy of trauma and displacement. The Moroccan slave trade was not a new phenomenon in the 15th century, but the increasing involvement of European powers, including the English, intensified its scale and impact. The demand for slaves fueled the cycle of violence and exploitation, perpetuating the capture and enslavement of Moroccan people. This period marked a significant shift in the dynamics of the slave trade, with European powers playing an increasingly dominant role. The experiences of Moroccan captives in the Andalusian slave markets were marked by hardship and brutality. They were subjected to inhumane conditions, including physical abuse, malnutrition, and disease. The process of being sold and transported to unknown destinations further compounded their suffering. Their stories, often lost to history, represent a tragic chapter in the history of slavery and its impact on Moroccan communities. Section 4. Depopulation and displacement along the Moroccan coast. The continuous raids and capture of Moroccans for the slave trade had a profound impact on the demographic landscape of the coastal regions. Entire villages and towns were depopulated, leading to significant social and economic disruption. The loss of human capital hindered agricultural production, fishing, and other essential economic activities. This decline in productivity further exacerbated the vulnerability of coastal communities to future raids and economic hardship. The depopulation also had long-term consequences for the social fabric of Moroccan society. The loss of family members and community leaders disrupted traditional social structures and created a sense of instability and insecurity. The constant threat of capture and enslavement undermined social cohesion and trust, leaving lasting scars on the collective memory of the affected communities. The impact of the slave trade extended beyond the immediate coastal areas. The displacement of populations led to migrations inland, putting pressure on resources and creating tensions with existing communities. The disruption of trade routes and economic networks further destabilized the region, contributing to social unrest and political instability. The depopulation of the Moroccan coast was not solely attributable to the slave trade, but it played a significant role in exacerbating existing social and economic challenges. Natural disasters, droughts, and internal conflicts also contributed to the decline of coastal communities. However, the constant threat of capture and enslavement created a unique set of challenges, undermining the resilience of these communities and hindering their ability to recover from other adversities. Section 5. The ripple effect. Long-term consequences. The long-term consequences of the 15th century slave trade involving Moroccan captives and English merchants extended far beyond the immediate demographic and economic impacts. The social and psychological trauma inflicted on individuals, families, and communities persisted for generations. The loss of cultural heritage, traditions, and knowledge systems further compounded the damage, disrupting the continuity of Moroccan society. The economic repercussions of the slave trade reverberated through the Moroccan's economy for centuries. The disruption of trade routes, the decline of agricultural production, and the loss of skilled laborers hindered economic development and contributed to long-term economic stagnation. The legacy of exploitation and underdevelopment can still be observed in some coastal regions of Morocco. The slave trade also played a role in shaping political relations between Morocco and European powers, including England. The competition for resources and control over trade routes fueled tensions and conflicts, contributing to a climate of mistrust and hostility. The legacy of this period continues to influence contemporary relations between these nations. The impact of the 15th century slave trade on Morocco serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of human exploitation and the long-lasting effects of historical injustices. The scars of this period are still visible in the social, economic and political landscape of Morocco, underscoring the importance of acknowledging and addressing the legacy of slavery. Section 6. Reclaiming history, the importance of accurate narratives. Revising the historical narrative surrounding the English involvement in the slave trade is essential for a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of this complex and tragic chapter in human history. Acknowledging the early English participation in the Andalusian slave markets challenges the conventional timeline and forces us to confront the long-standing connection between England and the practice of slavery. This revised narrative provides a more nuanced perspective on the roots of the transatlantic slave trade and the role of European powers in its development. Correcting historical inaccuracies is not merely an academic exercise, but a crucial step towards achieving social justice and reconciliation. By acknowledging the full extent of historical injustices, we can begin to address the lingering effects of slavery and colonialism on contemporary society. This process of reclaiming history empowers marginalized communities and promotes a more inclusive and equitable understanding of the past. Understanding the early stages of the English involvement in the slave trade is crucial for comprehending the subsequent development of the transatlantic slave trade. The experiences of Moroccan captives in the 15th century provide a valuable lens through which to examine the broader patterns of human exploitation and resistance that characterize this period. By studying these early forms of slavery, we can gain a deeper understanding of the motivations, methods, and consequences of this brutal practice. Revising the historical narrative is not about assigning blame or fostering resentment, but about seeking truth and promoting understanding. By acknowledging the complexities of the past, we can learn from past mistakes and work towards a more just and equitable future. This process of historical revision is an ongoing endeavor, requiring continuous research, critical analysis, and open dialogue.